We begin with some news just in from the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court has struck down most of Donald Trump's tariffs on global trading partners. Justices ruled by 6 votes to 3 that Trump lacked the authority under an emergency powers law to impose the levies. This past year, Trump placed sweeping tariffs on dozens of nations that trade with the U.S. The president has called the case one of the most important in U.S. history, saying a ruling against him would be an economic body blow to the nation. Well, let's cross over to DW's Komadovsky in Washington, D.C. Misha, tell us more about the Supreme Court ruling.
Well, Terry, the Supreme Court essentially says that President Trump went too far when he imposed sweeping tariffs under a law meant for national emergencies. And those tariffs are basically subject to his great pride. And the decision does not affect all of his tariffs. But it does strike down those put in place under a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So the justices said that the law does not give the president broad power to set tariffs in peacetime. The ruling blocks Trump's reciprocal tariffs, including those on Canada, on China, and on Mexico. And he argued that they were essential. They were needed to stop the flow of illegal drugs into the United States of America. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to impose taxes and duties. And the court said that the United States is not at war and emergency powers cannot replace Congress.
So what does this mean, Misha, for Donald Trump politically?
Good question. I mean, we haven't heard from him yet, but we have to say that the Supreme Court rarely limits presidential power in trade so directly, if I may. The legal reasoning may not shock some experts. However, the political impact is major. A number of constitutional and trade law experts had raised doubts on whether this International Emergency Economic Powers Act was ever meant to give a president broad tariff powers.
This is not the first time that courts have struck down one of Donald Trump's executive actions. Misha, what makes this ruling different?
Well, Terry, in the past, the justices sometimes limited President Trump's executive powers, and sometimes they allowed some actions to stand. In 2020, if we remember, the court blocked his attempt to end DACA. It's the Obama-era program protecting young undocumented immigrants in a case that involved the Department of Homeland Security. The court also rejected his effort to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. And at the same time, the court upheld some of his policies, including a revised version of his travel ban. Again, we have not heard from President Trump directly, but we expect it to happen anytime soon today, so stay tuned.
Misha, thank you very much. That was DW's Misha Komadovsky in D.C. And Clifford Coonan from DW Business has been tracking this story as well, waiting on this big day. A decision is finally here from the Supreme Court. Clifford, what does it mean for international trade?
Well, I think the imposition of these blanket tariffs shook global trade to its very core, and the removal of many of them will have a similarly large impact. However, I think we have to wait and see, and I hate to say wait and see, but we're still trying to assess what it means because this is huge. But on the other hand, we have to see how Donald Trump reacts. He can also impose tariffs in various sectors using other statutes that exist. And so much harm has been done to trust and predictability and all of these things that are necessary for global trade to take place that we're going to have to see how it unfolds. But it definitely is a blow for more predictability, for legal action in trade and all of these things that are the stability, the stable background that we need for global trade.
I mean, lots of decisions were made on the basis of these tariffs being imposed, investment decisions, reciprocal tariffs. It's really hard to undo all of this. How are markets likely to react?
Well, the markets, they initially rose. They were and rose by by 0.6%. The Dow rose initially. We had European markets also rose, but then they sort of came back a bit because markets are being cautious. They do welcome this. Retail stocks, car stocks, things like this, they obviously welcome this. But everyone's sort of assessing the reaction and the impact it will have. I mean, if we think about how, as you mentioned, how this was a tool that he was able to use, that Trump was able to use. He's going to China in April. And the big stick that he was going to carry when he was going to China was going to be the tariffs threat. And suddenly that's removed. So I think the repercussions of this are going to be enormous.
How might this ruling reshape U.S. trade relationships and negotiations that are ongoing in some cases? How is that going to be affected?
Well, I think that a lot of, like, if you take the Europeans, for example, who've been very, very nervous ever since Donald Trump came to power, and particularly since the imposition of the tariffs, I think that they see that the executive powers are limited by law in the States. I mean, that's a very important message, and that can also reassure European governments or Western governments around the world, frankly, in how, the idea that the Supreme Court says that he exceeded his authority, it's a big deal. So I think it's going to change international trade deals. I think you're going to see a lot more bilateral trade deals happening, for example. Maybe the WTO, the World Trade Organization, although I think that's really been sidelined for so long now. It'll be interesting to see whether it can come back. But it's going to have massive repercussions.
I can imagine that many consumers in the United States will also be wondering, how is this going to affect me directly? Because many have been screaming about prices rising. Do you think this could have an impact on consumer prices in the U.S.?
I think so. I mean, the Federal Reserve Bank in New York said that U.S. firms and consumers had bore the bulk, like roughly 90% of the economic burden of tariffs imposed in 2025. So it should help them in that, and it should be managed to bring down things, and it'll be good for consumers.
A big deal indeed. Clifford Coonan from DW Business, thank you so much.